Countries around the world are dealing with devastating wildfires. Long periods of drought and excessive heat are contributing. But what about our role as humans? And is climate change now a bigger worry than it's ever been? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Halla Mohieddeen. The last few months have seen a number of devastating weather events made worse by climate change. Countries around the world are seeing unprecedented changes. Last month, a small village in Western Canada set that country's highest record, marking nearly 50 degrees Celsius. Scientists say average temperatures are on the rise. Wildfires seem to appear more often and more destructive. And Europe has seen its worst floods in a generation. So what's behind all this? Well, we'll put that to our guests in just a moment. First, though, let's have a quick look at the global picture. In Turkey, areas hosting popular resorts and tourist destinations have been declared disaster zones. At least a dozen fires are burning across its Mediterranean coast. Emergency crews are struggling to cope as they help move hundreds of people to safety. Similar scenes in Italy's southern island of Sicily, where people have been forced to leave their homes. Fires there are spreading rapidly, destroying houses and forcing hundreds of tourists to flee the city of Catania. In Russia, one of the coldest places on Earth, fires have burned nearly 1 million hectares of forest. Scientists are warning the situation in Siberia is only going to get worse as the region's average temperatures continue to rise. In the western US state of Oregon, thunderstorms are sparking dozens of fires there, while a large one, known as the Bootleg Fire, continues to burn, creating its own weather system and sending huge plumes of smoke thousands of kilometers all the way to New York City in the east. Well, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Seattle is Raymond, a climate adaptation specialist at the University of Washington. In Sydney, Mark Diesendorf, an Honorary Associate Professor of Environmental Sciences at the University of New South Wales. And in Sao Paulo, Cristiane Mazetti, a Senior Forest Campaigner at Greenpeace Brazil. Warm welcome to all three of you. Now, Raymond, you're a fire ecologist. Given the number of wildfires we're seeing worldwide, and I've just outlined some of them, looking at the global picture, would you say this is normal?
Well, I think, no, we're definitely seeing that warmer temperatures, drier summers associated with climate change are speeding up the wildfires that we have globally. And we're seeing larger area burned by wildfires and more frequent large fires in many places around the world.
But we also know, Raymond, that wildfires can be a very natural and normal event. How does that fit into the picture that we're seeing? Because it's difficult to hear wildfires are common and seeing the scale of the wildfires in places that we wouldn't normally expect to see them. I mean, how do you marry the two?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. We do have to remember that many systems naturally have wildfire. There's many vegetation types and forest types around the world that are actually adapted to wildfire. The plants, the vegetation there in many cases needs wildfire to grow. So we know that's the case and that wildfire can be a natural part of the system. But there's several things that have happened that have caused it to play more of an unnatural role than it might otherwise play. And in addition to climate change, we also know that the way that we have managed forests or vegetation has contributed to getting larger and more severe fires. And one of the main things that's happened is that we've tried to completely remove fire from the system that actually needs fire. And in that case, when you do that, the vegetation builds up. There becomes a lot more trees, a lot more vegetation there than there might otherwise be. And then when a small fire starts, it can get very big very quickly because there's so much more fuel to burn in that wildfire. And we see that throughout different fires in the West, for sure.
That's an interesting point, and I want to come back to land management in a moment. But Mark Diesendorf, you're joining us from Australia, where we saw those heartbreakingly awful wildfires last year. Millions of animals died. I remember seeing the map showing the equivalent areas around the UK, how much of the land would be covered if those wildfires were taking place elsewhere. With those fires appear to be unprecedented, but we also know that wildfires are reasonably common and often useful to manage the land. What would you say is behind fires of that size and scale, particularly in Australia? I mean, is it down to climate change, or are there other factors at play in that example?
Well, climate change is increasing the severity and the frequency of these fires. We now have a new classification of fire intensity, which is catastrophic, which we have never had before. The terrible fires in Eastern Australia that you mentioned covered a much, much greater area than fires in the past have ever covered. And for the first time ever, they burned rainforest. And that is totally new for Australia. So I would say, yes, they are unprecedented. Climate change due to global warming is playing a substantial role, and we really need to act fast. We're running out of time.
It's interesting that you say catastrophic is a new classification. Certainly in the news, we talk about devastating wildfires. You never really hear headlines talking about really good wildfires. But in terms of this new classification of catastrophic, how is that manifesting? If you look not just at Australia, but around the world, this new classification, why has it needed to be brought in? Are there other areas in the world where this has had to be applied? Is that something that we are seeing in recent years?
Well, it's an Australian classification. I can't answer for the rest of the world, but we now know from the firefighters who faced up to the terrible fires of that summer that they considered that these fires are unstoppable. And really, a large part of Sydney would have been wiped out if the wind hadn't changed in the last minute after one of the most huge fires that came down from the Blue Mountains just stopped in time to avoid essentially wiping out northern Sydney. So we're facing a new situation, and climate change is one of the vital drivers of this new severity and intensity and frequency of these fires.
Okay, Cristiane Mazetti, you're joining us from Brazil, obviously, where the challenges, environmental challenges surrounding the Amazon rainforest in particular have been well documented. The fires that are burning in your part of the world, I mean, is climate change a factor in any way, or is this entirely man-made, the destruction that's ongoing where you are?
I would say that in the Amazon, which is a fire-sensitive ecosystem, which means that the fire is negative for the biome, the fires are started by humans, most or 99% of the time. They use it basically for renewing agricultural land or in the deforestation process. And sometimes that fire goes and spreads to the forest and becomes a wildfire. And of course, climate change happens, that helps to the occurrence of the fires. But indeed, by the time that we deforest and burn forests to open way for cattle ranching, agriculture land, we reduce the resilience of the forests to climate change as well.
But it's not just, so climate change seems like a big banner, a big sticker we can put on something to say this is the reason why this is bad or this is good. But climate change, it can have other impacts As well, can it not, Cristiane Mazetti, in terms of when it's too hot and it forces people to move elsewhere to try and grow products, or the climate change can cause a lack of potable water, for example, forcing people to turn to other means. Do you see other side effects of climate change impacting the way people are having to live their lives in Latin America, for example?
Yeah, I would say that looking at the Amazon, the combination of climate change and deforestation and fires is indeed making the weather drier. And we already have studies that are published showing that yields of corn crops, soy crop were reduced due to changing weather patterns in the local scale due to deforestation and climate change. So indeed, production yields will be reduced and are already being reduced due to those changes in the local landscapes.
Okay, let me turn to you now, Crystal Raymond, because again, it's not just the fact that the areas are getting warmer that's causing these fires to break out. You had mentioned earlier how fires can be, certainly can help regenerate certain areas, but because of the way this land has been managed, this is having unintended consequences. Now, in the United States, in particular in the Northwest, for example, we are seeing certain challenges when it comes to land management. Former President Donald Trump had been quite critical of the way the land had been managed, and he took some flack for that, for suggesting that this brush wasn't cleared away. But there are other things as well which are contributing to these fires. Specifically, we're building closer to forests and building in places we shouldn't be. Do you think there's an appreciation that of the way that we're impacting and living in certain areas that arguably humans shouldn't be, that's helping contribute to the devastating nature of some of these fires?
Yeah, that's right. I think the way that people are building where we're living is contributing to it. In the Western United States, we call it the wildland-urban interface, and that's where homes and development start to move out further into the forest and the wilderness. And we see that, people are starting to build their homes there, and it can, even though fire may occur there regularly, it hasn't for a very long time. And so people aren't familiar with their environment. They're not aware that they're moving into a potentially fire-prone area. And the way that people are building in those areas is not as careful as it could be to recognize that they do live in a place that is fire-prone. So we know that people need homes, people need to live in these places, but there's a way that that development and that building can be done that can reduce the risk associated with wildfires to these communities.
Is there an effort on a governmental level to try and change the mindset of building homes in certain areas and so on? Because there are real pressures when it comes to housing stock. Certainly in the UK, where I'm from, there's big pressures on housing stock. And there's incentives for local authorities to go out and build on green land or build on floodplains. Are there the same incentives in the United States? And is there more of a realization that perhaps we need to think about the way we're housing people if we want to maintain the environment?
Right. I think there's not a consistent sort of government response to this. I think it's happening locally. It's happening in places here and there. There's a lot of education about it. But I don't think that there's a consistent messaging or education around it as much as there could be to enable this housing to be built in such a way that would be less at risk.
Okay, Mark Diesendorf, Australia is well known for having wide plains of land, vast expanses of land and so on. But are there similar sort of tensions at this human-rural interface where humans choose to build their homes? Is this having any kind of impact, negative environmental impact? Is this something that is coming into policy decisions in any way?
Well, it should be coming into policy decisions because some people feel that some of the towns and villages in the forested areas should not really exist and that people should move. And really, people have responded in different ways to the fires. Some people are trying to rebuild in the same places. other people are leaving these areas. And there are also financial incentives for local government to encourage as much housing development as possible in their areas, because they get paid rates, income from housing in those areas. And it's the same with floodplains that you alluded to, that people are building in floodplains where they shouldn't really be building. And it could be mentioned really that in Australia, after the terrible fires, we then had floods. And floods are also partly driven by climate change, because as the atmosphere becomes warmer, it holds more water. And then when it does rain, it can rain much more heavily than previously. And so we can get floods coming along also as partly caused by global climate change.
And this is certainly something we're seeing in Europe with the staggering loss of life in places like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany that we hadn't seen before. Do you think this is the new normal, Mark Diesendorf? Do you think this is the scenes that we're seeing of flooding in urban areas, of wildfires covering huge expanses of land? Is this the new normal, or is there a way of turning the clock back?
It's going to get worse before it gets better. And yes, there are solutions. 3/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from burning fossil fuels. And we now have most of the technologies we need to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy and efficient energy use. Wind and solar are really much cheaper than fossil fuels and nuclear power in the vast majority of the world, and they're still getting cheaper. So we know that these technologies, together with some additional storage and some additional transmission lines, can substitute for fossil fuels. So the first thing is to transition all electricity to renewables, and then to and at the same time to move our transport from oil-driven cars and trucks to electric cars and trucks.
Well, it sounds so simple, but if it were that simple to just switch everything to renewables, why is it not happening?
Well, it is happening with electricity generation very quickly in many parts of the world now. And for example, in one of our states, South Australia, 60% of annual electricity generation comes from wind and sun already. Okay. And similarly in Denmark, the vast majority of electricity generation comes from the wind, with some agricultural wastes used to produce bioenergy. And Scotland also has the vast majority of its electricity generation already coming from renewables, mostly wind.
So it's just a question of rolling this out to larger countries, thinking obviously of China, the United States, and so on and so forth. Let me turn to you now, Cristiane Mazetti. Now, in Brazil, there are very real tensions when it comes to environmental management and the need to protect the environment and the need to pull people out of poverty. The current president, Jair Bolsonaro, he is criticised by large chunks of the population, but he does still have a significant support base. And the people who are supporting him, the people who are in favour of logging in the Amazon and clearing land for agriculture, are in favour not because they hate the planet, but because they want to work and earn money. So given this tension between environmental protection and lifting people out of poverty and putting food on the table, I mean, how do you square that circle? Where does the solution there lie?
Okay, firstly, I would like to point out that there is no, it's not controversial. We don't need to destroy the environment to promote development in the region. If you look at the Amazon, we have for now like 30, 40, 50 years of the same development model being implemented there, which is cutting off the forest and putting pasture lands or agriculture lands. And still, the region has a lot of poverty, is one of the most poor regions in Brazil, you know. So what we need is a different concept of development for the region, development that actually includes local people, and brings development to them, brings economic opportunity to them. There are many opportunities of economic development with the standing forest, using seeds, oils, and other things that can be taken from the forest. What we need is political will for enhancing those alternatives.
So why is there no political will
is
there? Because the Bolsonaro supporters and Bolsonaro himself would say, you know, we want to lift the people out of poverty. If these solutions are already there, why are these people not turning to them if the solution is sitting there in front of us?
The solutions, they exist, but they are not yet, they do not yet have public policy to actually make them spread around the territory. So the person that's there on the ground finds their way much easier if they go to illegal deforestation, illegal mining, and so on, rather than if they go to a bank and try to get a loan to start a new business. So we still need a lot of public policies and incentives in that direction. And that's why I say that there is no incentive to that end.
Okay, Crystal Raymond, do you think our politicians have a handle on how to tackle these problems? Because scientists such as yourself are coming forward with solutions. We've heard from Mark Diesendorf that yes, there are solutions as we move forward, but as Cristiane was saying, I mean, there needs to be a political will. Do you think that there is political will to bring in the measures needed to tackle these wildfires, for example, global warming? Because there are big costs involved, are there not? And people may not be prepared to pay those costs when you put it down on the breakfast table in front of them.
I think that there's some political will around wildfires. We're seeing some increase in funding, but I think there's also still people debating more about the causes, debating whether this is climate change or forest management, rather than recognizing it's multiple factors and that different factors are playing a role in different places around the US. And so the solutions need to be responsive to those different factors that are contributing to wildfires. And so I think that politicians are still not recognizing the complexity of the issue and debating about whether climate change is contributing to it, debating about whether forest management contributes to it, rather than looking at how much each of those factors matter in different places, because that can really be a way to get at the right solutions in the right places. So I think that that's starting to change. Unfortunately, it's taking multiple years of above average wildfires in order to really motivate that change.
Okay, we're down to the last minute and a half here, so I'm going to ask the same question to all three of you. Given what we've heard, given about the complexity of the situation, how damaging it is, are you optimistic for the future? And I will start with you, Mark Diesendorf. Are you optimistic of the future, given where we are?
I'm optimistic that we'll implement the technologies we need to transform the energy system, for example, but I'm pessimistic that it will occur too late to stop even greater climate change. And the reason it's occurring so late is because the existing industries, the fossil fuel industries, the forestry industry, and other industries that have a vested interest in continuing with business as usual, are fighting and resisting the change.
Okay, just in one sentence, please, Cristiane Mazetti, are you optimistic for the future?
Right now, I am a little bit pessimistic because, well, our government's weakening the environmental protection, the maximum they can, also the National Congress, but I'm optimistic because many people here are trying to face this agenda, are thinking about a more positive agenda. So, yeah, both of them.
Okay, and the final word to you, Crystal Raymond. Are you optimistic or pessimistic, given the state of the world as it stands?
Yeah, in my 20-year career working on climate change, I've always been optimistic. The extreme events we've seen in the last year or two have definitely started to challenge that. But I have very young children, so I feel like I have no choice but to be optimistic because I want to make sure that this world is in a good place for them when they're older.
Okay, well, we'll finish on that optimistic and uplifting note. Thank you very much, Crystal, Raymond, Mark Diesendorf and Cristiane Mazetti. And thank you too for watching at home. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just head to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. But for now, for me and the whole team, it's bye for now.